Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Today we're going to talk about a novel that you probably think could never be written. The title is The Trial of Prisoner 043. I call it a novel of realistic fiction. The author is here. His name is Terry Jastrow, and the book is published by Four Springs Press. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for stopping by. The reason why I feel that it might have been difficult to get this published is its subject matter. Its subject matter is, to put it bluntly, the former President of the United States, George W. Bush, is on trial in an international court for war crimes. That's the plot. That's the story. Congratulations for getting it done.
Well, thank you. It is a fiction, and the story takes place in the not-too-distant future. But yes, it imagines that George W. Bush is abducted off a golf course in St Andrews, Scotland, and transported to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to stand trial for war crimes, of course, in connection with the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm. And there's a cliche question that author interviewers, always ask, and you have a rather different answer to it. The cliche question is, why did you write the book? And you said, I spent 3.5 years researching and writing this story because I believe it is important for the future of all humankind. That's a pretty big piece to chew.
Yes, I understand, but when you consider how much more powerful and destructive war is and war machinery is, if more and more unnecessary wars are fought, it puts to a greater degree the well-being of all of humankind in jeopardy. And I thought, and I continue to believe, that the only prevention of more such wars is an informed and engaged citizenry, the voice of the people, the power of the people. And one of the byproducts of this book, I hope, is that people will become aware of first of all, the fact that there is international criminal law in addition to just domestic law, and that there is such a thing as the International Criminal Court, which stands, very solidly in The Hague, which is a little area in the Netherlands.
Some critics would say, looking at your background, I guess, and reading the book a little bit, that your book is the rant of a liberal elite folk.
Nothing could be further from the truth. I will tell you that I am actually a descendant of a family that arrived on the Mayflower, and the second president of the United States, John Adams. I was born in Colorado, raised and educated in Texas. I'm the guy who's singing the national anthem way off key and much too loud with a tear in his eye. I'm as American as they come.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Some of your critics aren't going to be, I can tell you that. The book, let's get to the story. The book begins with George W. Bush, I love this, being abducted while enjoying an early morning game of golf at St Andrews in Edinburgh. And he runs into trouble. He's whisked away. What happened to George?
Well, he's playing the 17th hole, which is probably the most famous hole of the most famous golf course in the world. The 17th is called the Road Hole, and it's a par 4 and dogleg right, and he actually pushes his tee shot in the right rough, close to a little small rock wall that's about 2.5, 3 feet high, and he's in the right rough. And as he arrives at his ball and begins to assess his shot, a team of British military swoop in, and in less than 6 minutes control and contain his Secret Service minders and his caddies and his fellow players, bind him and gag him and put him in a van and take him away. Less than 6 minutes.
You didn't replicate this, did you? I mean, just in your mind.
Only in my mind.
Okay. It sounds like a fun trip, It's a fast way to get to The Hague.
Yes, it is. And a nice time visiting St. Andrews as well.
Now, the JCC, at this moment in time in the story, has spent a year or more developing a case against Bush.
Right. In the International Court, in the International Criminal Court, there is a division, an office called the Office of the Prosecution.
Right.
And within it, there is the pretrial chamber. And its purpose is to evaluate the legitimacy of crimes, of accusations that are presented to it. And in this case, actually the country of Iraq, former generals in the Iraq War, it's actually Article 12C of the Rome Statute, has allowed the jurisdiction of the case to be held by the International Criminal Court. And they've taken more than a year to assess the validity of the case before they actually took the steps to bring George W. Bush in to stand trial.
And so it goes. He is brought in and he's taken very good care of, I think, for being a prisoner.
Yes, this is an important point, Jim. I tried very, very hard, and I'm comfortable that I was reasonably successful in this. Tried not to be disrespectful or defame him in any way. I tried to simply tell the most accurate story I could and advocate aggressively for both George W. Bush's defense and the prosecution at the ICC, so that the reader could make up their minds for themselves with regard to guilt or innocence.
I think you would argue that next to Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein was small potatoes, and that's why it took 1 year and 5.5 months to sell the war.
The fact is that comparison of Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden would be accurate when we look at the year of 2001, because we have to remember that 9/11 was 2001,
Yeah.
and the mastermind of 9/11 was Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
But Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, and George W. Bush then alleged that he had weapons of mass destruction. And as it was confirmed by weapons experts from the United Nations and from the United States, and even coalition forces when they got there, he had no weapons of mass destruction. And the facts are he hadn't had weapons of mass destruction since the 1980s. So in the year of 2001, where the beginning of this story happens, and George W. Bush wages his war in March of 2003 to be very sure Osama bin Laden was the target, and Saddam Hussein was certainly not the target and hadn't been a target for a number of years.
And that's that position, that essentially he declared war on the wrong guy from the wrong country. Is that now accepted by, quote, everybody, unquote, or is that still in controversy?
Let me answer that two ways. Following 9/11, there was a huge outpouring of sympathy and love for the United States.
Right.
And George W. Bush's approval rating was 90%. I think the single highest approval rating for any American president ever. And he went in, alleging this thing about Saddam's complicity in 9/11, which wasn't true, that he had weapons of mass destruction, not true. And then he went in with the pretext of trying to export democracy to Iraq, which they didn't want.
Yeah,
and
make them a democratic country.
Which,
it's really insane.
You said that. I don't disagree with that. But the thing to make your point, though, is that when the war was over, 8 years and 9 months later, Bush's approval rating was 25%, the greatest drop of any president from terms of approval rating. It was from 90% to 25%, and his approval rating was similar to Harry Truman, who dropped two atomic bombs on Japan, and Richard Nixon, who lied repeatedly to the Americans regarding the Vietnam War and Watergate. That was the same public approval that George W. Bush had.
You know what, Terry? W needs a rest. He needs a break. So we'll take one now, and we'll be coming right back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Today on Conversations on the Coast, we're talking about the trial of prisoner 043. It's a novel of realistic fiction written by Terry Jastrow, published by Four Springs Press. And Michael Sharp, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law and co-author of Enemy of the State, has this to say about the book. With echoes of Nuremberg, Jarrow's masterpiece of realistic fiction will inspire some, anger others, and provoke water-cooler conversation across our divided nation. Whatever your position on the legitimacy of the war in Iraq, this is a book you're going to want to read. It's very true. I mean, I got the book, and the war in Iraq was back there someplace. And now it's up front where it should be, because it's part of the seemingly unending history that we're in now, to be a warring country forever. And it's an important part of it, and one we should be aware of.
Yes, indeed, Jim, and it must be said that during that war, 4,491 American soldiers were killed. 230,000 American soldiers were wounded, either mentally and or physically, that we're still trying to care for our wounded warriors. And if that's not bad enough, that war killed 1 million Iraqis. So it's not okay to forget about the carnage that happened in that war and move on with our lives.
I think one could say one of the other consequences of the war was it took the country away from Iraqis. They didn't have an Iraq when it was over.
That's right.
They had a dismembered mess.
Right, which created the vacuum that the Islamic State was founded and formed for the first time.
You know, Terry, I've done quite a few author interviews in my time, but I've never had the chance to ask one question that I've always wanted to ask. And today's my day, because with us, joining us, is the wonderful Ann Archer, very close friend of yours. Ann is an actress nominated for an Academy Award, a Golden Globe, British equivalent of the Academy Award for her role as Michael Douglas' sympathetic, tortured wife, Beth Gallagher, in Adrian Lyne's 1987 thriller Fatal Attraction. She's also well known for her poignant Golden Globe-winning performance in the ensemble cast of Robert Altman's Shortcuts, and for playing CIA agent Jack Ryan's beleaguered wife, Kathy. You got some lousy wife parts here. In Patriots Game and Clear and Present Danger. Beyond all that, she founded in 2006 something called Artists for Human Rights, whose purpose is to bring artists together with the common cause of raising awareness of human rights around the world. You couldn't have a better wife than that, you know? I mean, why the heck did you have to write a novel? You got to, never mind. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Nice to have you with us. Now, I get to ask the question. Clearly, Anne is quite something. She's overly qualified, perhaps, to answer my question. Anne, how do you feel about Terry writing this book, and how hard was it all on you?
Well, when he first told me that he was interested in writing this particular novel, it was hard for me because I thought, you're going after a president, and Terry comes from Texas. He's known Bush over the years, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, wait, that's one of the most surprising thing for me in the bio info from the publicist, my dear friend, was, well, Terry and George used to go out and do things together down in Texas.
Well, they played Little League Baseball against each other. Terry's daddy, as they say in Texas, and George W.'s daddy were in the oil business. And at the University of Texas, Terry socialized with them a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. We were actually in the governor's office, invited by George W. when he was governor of Texas. We supported his campaign. Terry voted for him the first time around. This is not a personal vendetta against George W. Bush at all. It's just that if there are war crimes committed, it is the single person most, according to international criminal law, it is the single person most responsible for the war, and that is always the head of state.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's George W. If he were convicted, say this happened, then one could go after Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, et cetera, et cetera. But you always have to start with the head of state. So that's why George W. Once I got used to the idea of what he was trying to do and why, I really embraced it, because it is about human rights, which has been my
Your thing,
cause all
yeah.
my life.
Yeah.
And because of the enormous loss of human life, this is something we cannot ignore. And he upset the whole balance of power in the Middle East. And as Terry said, out of it came the Islamic State. We wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for the Iraq War. The Shiites and the Sunnis have never gotten along. It's always been very difficult in the Middle East, and how naive and irresponsible of us it was to think that we could go into that country and export democracy. We don't understand that culture. We have very little in common with it. Now, in time, yes, these things can happen, but to do it with a war in the way we did, as awful a man as Saddam Hussein was a horrific mistake. And when I see the loss of life, it breaks my heart. So for Terry to write this book was really important. And he researched it for over 3.5 years. He visited The Hague in the Netherlands 3 times. He talked to every law expert on the subject. And it is realistic fiction, because every single thing that happens in that book is based on correct international law, could happen. What did happen in the war is accurately portrayed in the book, and those put on trial. The questions are very real. So, and as Terry said, the other thing that makes me feel good about the book is it's very balanced. Frankly, it tells both sides of the story very well. And one might decide that Bush was right, and one might decide that Bush was wrong. It has a very surprising ending, too, which makes it a page-turner and a great read.
Can you see any way or ways that the book might have effect on today's political landscape?
I hope so.
Yeah, I
I
do
think
too,
this
but
is a lesson.
I'm just wondering what's the means for getting that done? I mean,
Well, as Terry would say, and you speak up too, darling, it's raising awareness of international criminal law. I mean, the International Criminal Court does stand above all national courts. It was created by the United Nations. There are 134 signatories to it. We should be a signatory to it, and as Terry will tell you, at the end of the Clinton administration, he actually signed the papers to become a member of the International Criminal Court, and 2 months later, when Bush was president, he unsigned it. So we should be a part of that court. It doesn't mean that the United States or George W. couldn't be brought to trial, even though we're not a member, because members, if the home country, what is it, darling, are unwilling or unable to bring to trial someone who is accused of war crimes, then the International Criminal Court, member states of the International Criminal Court have a right to bring that individual to trial.
right. I hope.
Yeah.
The point that I think Terry makes, maybe in conversation, was he wants to begin awareness of the situation, to get it back people's minds, like in my mind, for example. But it's that next step that's a tough one. The leap, as it were, from that consciousness being raised to finding the correct actions and taking them, because the people who are responsible for lying and misleading and bad policy, et cetera, are professional at it. And I'm not, and you're not, even with all the research you spent on the book. It's a tough haul. It's a tough haul, but it has to be begun. And that's what you're doing, and I congratulate you for it.
I thank you for that, but I think we would agree that the first step in this process of citizen involvement would start with awareness, and then activism, and then protest. All of us of our age in this room will remember very well the protest during the Vietnam War that actually helped end that war. And that was basically the young people of America, the college students that stood up and said, that's enough, this is a terrible war and we have to stop. So one of my great hopes is that people will become sensitized to, aware of it, begin a kind of an activism, and if necessary, a protest, because the people elect the government officials, and if they're not doing the will of the people, then the people need to stand up and be counted and protest such things and try to change it.
And then I think to myself, the president is now you-know-who, which is very disturbing relative to getting anything of that nature done. I mean, he is so egotistical that it's frightening.
Well, I've tried to stay out of a personal
I
comment
know.
about President
I'm
Trump.
sorry for bringing it up.
Well, I would just say that there are courts in the United States. There is U.S. law, but if he is conceived to be guilty of a crime, or perhaps had committed a crime, if the United States does not bring legal action to him, then it defaults to the International Criminal Court. So I think one of the lessons of this novel is, for everybody who reads it, is that there is such a thing as international criminal law. And there is, the International Criminal Court is open for business at The Hague. So it's not just a question of Donald Trump being a citizen of the United States, but him being a citizen of all mankind.
Yeah. Well, this time I'm tired. We're going to take another break.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Terry Jastrow, I want you to remember that name. He's the author of a very important piece of fiction, or as we've decided to call it, realistic fiction, the title of which is The Trial of Prisoner 043. Prisoner 043 is George W. Bush. The book is published by Four Springs Press, and it has received a lot of pre-publication praise, and I want to share one of those with you. Terry Jastrow's brilliant, biting novel is a must-read for anyone who cares about international peace, war crimes past and future, and how justice can be delivered in unexpected ways. If you think you know how this story ends, start reading now. I like it when they end with an order. Start reading now. Sarah Lovett gives us that advice. She's the co-author with Valerie Plame of New York Times bestseller Blowback. So here we are. We've got one final segment to go, and I'm going to stick you with what fascinates the hell out of me, and that is this combination of real folks and fictional folks. When did you decide to do that? Was it fun? And have there been any negative consequences?
Well, no to the last part of the question. I spent during the 3.5 years of researching and writing the book. I took 3 trips to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and spent more than a week each time. And I interviewed both the prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys at the International Criminal Court. And as this story had to be imagined, because it is fiction, it was easy to imagine the defense attorneys, because obviously they would be engaged by George W. Bush. And, you know, I knew him when we were kids. We both grew up in Texas. I had an idea of what his defense team was going to be. But the prosecuting attorneys, I learned a lot from my trips at the International Criminal Court. So the prosecuting attorney, who is as a man, comes from Denver, Colorado, and the co-prosecuting attorney is a woman who was born in Fallujah, Iraq. So they lead the prosecution team, and at that point, these are fictional characters, and so one just imagined. But after
one of them came from Fallujah.
One of them came from Fallujah, but it's after tons of research and lots of dialogue with prosecuting attorneys. I mean, I'm not just making this up. I'm studying and understanding and getting real facts and stuff that would be a valid argument in terms of prosecuting George W. Bush's case.
Mm-hmm. So that's how those cats were chosen. And of course, their names are fictional. And there are some people in here who ain't fictional. Those are the ones that concern me. For the prosecution, those were both fictional. Michael McBride and Nadia Shadid.
Shadid, yes, both fictional.
There. The defense attorney, Meredith Lott,
Yes.
and Jonathan Ortloff.
Yes.
Now, Meredith seems very real to me.
Thank you very much. She's fictional.
Oh, see that? I don't know what I'm doing.
No, you do, but it's an amalgamation of tons of research that can, sort of yield a character.
Okay, all right. The guy that comes in at the end, and I don't want to give away the ending. He sounds so real in terms of his function. There's a character at the end of the book who, in my opinion, represents things as they were, and he plays a big part in the conclusion of the book.
Good. Thank you for saying that. I think we should just leave it that it's not what the reader thinks it might be, and to sort of figure it out, they need to read the novel.
I have one more dumb question. Did you send George W. a copy?
I don't know, Ann. What do you think?
I don't know. We haven't discussed that. Is that a good idea or not? I think he's painting on his ranch. He's probably passing him right by.
The book raises a number of different questions as one reads it. But the overarching one, in my opinion, is this. How did the United States of America wind up in a quagmire of endless wars in the Middle East? We're not a Middle East country, I'm quite sure.
No, we are not. And we can just say off the crack of the bat that the United States has no business waging war against a country on the other side of the world that does not present a clear and present danger. And this all started with George W. Bush's switch from being unable to get Osama bin Laden after more than a year and turning everybody's attention to Saddam Hussein, and who was actually doing nothing, was not involved in 9/11, as we've said, had no weapons of mass destruction, and it was based on false information and false allegation that started the war. And during the early parts of the Iraq War, the U.S. military embraced the Iraqi military, and after only a few months, they ended up firing them and letting them go. And many of those former Iraqi military became the genesis that started the Islamic State. And that's the entity, whether we call it ISIS today or Daesh. It started after this catastrophe of Bush's war started, and we're suffering the problems even to this day.
There's a lot of opinion out there that says that one of the other reasons that Bush started the war was that he wanted a war victory, the thing that his father could not get. Is there any truth to that, or is that?
Well, one hears that and one reads that, and there's also the sense that he wanted to avenge the attempted death threat. It was Saddam Hussein apparently tried to kill George W. Bush's father, President George H.W. Bush, and didn't do it. There are all kinds of sort of things out there. It has to do with protection of the oil, protection of Israel. None of them were pretexts for war. None of them were grounds actually to wage the war. Under any circumstances, it was a war that was fought not for the right reasons. And all the residual and collateral problems that we face today can be and should be focused on the start of that war, and the people that started it should be held accountable for it.
Well, The Trial of Prisoner 043 is a novel of realistic fiction. It's written by Terry Jastrow, and it's something you should be reading now and thinking about in the days ahead. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.